Well, good day, my friends. It's your old pal Jordan the Lion, and we are in Los Angeles today. We are talking about, or we're going to talk about, the life of a guitar player that Jimi Hendrix once said was the greatest guitar player alive. He was Terry Kath of Chicago, and he had a very tragic ending to his life. We're going to talk about his life and death today. Daze with Jordan the Lion and you all. It begins right now. There's our awesome co-host right there, Ja. So you want to come to the very top section, the Garden of Remembrance, to find Terry. You'll see this big giant statue, and you'll take this passageway, and the garden that he's located in is the second garden past here. So Terry is buried back here in what they call a quasi-private garden. It's section 15. Right here, next to his parents, Ray Kath, Evelyn Kath, Terry Allen Kath, our loved one, it says. If you want to see some great documentary footage, his daughter did a fantastic documentary. Terry Kath, 1946 to 1978. Composer, guitarist, singer. Says the memories of love he left on earth, all the world has shared. Rare and gifted, gentle man whose riches were a symphony of songs for young and old because he cared. Our loved one. So Terry grew up in Chicago, hence the band name Chicago, and he was never trained as a musician. Got him a guitar when he was young, and he just noticed that he could play by ear without ever having any lessons. He could kind of play what he heard and became pretty good. He became a guitar player and could also play bass, and so he ended up playing with some local guys, and then in a kind of a funny story, kind of started attending DePaul University without being a student. The guys that would eventually form Chicago would all basically meet there, and they said he was never enrolled, but you saw him everywhere you went, and he knew music, so even though he had never studied it, he fit right in with everyone there. And so they formed a little band doing cover songs around there, playing local joints in Chicago. A place called the Pussycat A Go-Go was the main place they would play. But then a member of the group, and this original incarnation had horns, a member of the group was invited to be in the band for the Dick Clark Caravan of Stars. And so he got one of the other guys a gig, and they said, you know what, we can't do it without Terry. We need a guitar player for this gig, right? And they said, no, we got a guitar player already. And they said, well, we can't do the gig without Terry. They said, well, we need a bass player. So they went to Terry and said, can you learn bass? And he said, yeah, I'll do it. That's fine. So they went off and did this caravan for a couple of dates, and then started seriously considering doing this as a full-time project. So they formed a band called The Big Thing, and they started playing shows, and they were all cover songs, of course, like I said. And they're pretty good, but they just didn't love that kind of gig. They eventually saw themselves as something bigger. And so one night as they were playing that show, the guy who hired them came up and said, hey, play a Belly Rubber for me. And one of the guys in the band describes that as like a song where people could slow dance and dance close together. And when they said that, something just, a look in Terry's eye happened. They said Terry started playing a Mothers of Invention song, a Frank Zappa song, and was like gyrating and dancing around and stuff. And the owner got furious and ended up firing the guys. And so they thought that was fine. And they decided, hey, this is the last time we play a gig as the big thing. And they changed their name to Chicago Transit Authority and continued playing cover songs. They were a successful cover band, so they could get booked all over the Midwest. But then they met a man who was a producer and had produced Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And he said, I like what you're doing, but I can't use, you know, a band that doesn't do its original song. So he said, you know, if you guys come up with your own songs and, you know, you have the talent, if you get out of Chicago, I think you might have something. And so that's basically what started the band Chicago, that we would see catapult into the stratosphere of top 40 hits. They were actually talked into moving out to Los Angeles. So I'm gonna take us over to the house that they all rented together. They basically holed up over there and wrote a ton of songs before they went off and made their first recording. So I'm gonna take us over to that house. We're gonna, you know, talk about, unfortunately, what happened to Terry and how Terry passed. It was really tragic. I mean, this was nothing that anyone saw coming. He was only, you know, 32 years old and left behind a wife and a 2-year-old daughter. And there was speculation for a while, or some people put the rumor out that he had done it intentionally, but everyone that knew him and everyone that knew the situation said absolutely not, that it was a total accident. So this actually brings me over to my old neighborhood in Hollywood. That's the supermarket the Brady Bunch was discovered at in that episode right beside us. Yep, that one. So they moved out here in June of 1968. Penko, Seraphin, the singer bass player Peter Cetera, and saxophonist Walt Parazader threw their personal items and the band's belongings into a U-Haul and drove west. Lamb guitarist Terry Kath and Lee Launane preferred to fly. When they got here, this was the house that they moved into. It was a 1920 built house, and apparently Terry Kath would live in this house with a couple of the roadies, and the guys that were married, Peter Cetera, Parazader, and Seraphin, would live right around the corner on Primrose in apartments. So this is Primrose. This will show you how close they were. They literally could just walk over and practice at that house, because they would have lived probably in apartments probably right over there. Wonder if the people that live here have any idea of the history of this property, the amazing songs that were written here. They probably practiced in that garage back there. Basically, they went from being a cover band with a horn section that was really good. I mean, everybody said, even the bookers would say, you guys are amazing for what you do, but you'll never get further than Vegas. So Terry was going to take off to New York, it was said, to work on original music, and they talked him into staying. They said, we'll get a really amazing horn section and we'll move to Los Angeles. So they moved here. This is where they worked on everything for the first album. Terry was, even though he was not a trained musician or anything, he was looked at as the leader of the band. He wrote a lot of the basis of what they were working on. He was extremely, extremely creative, and so they worked on things here for about a month and ended up becoming friends. Terry himself became friends with the owner of the Whiskey A Go Go, Mario. Mario even baptized his daughter. But the Whiskey loved Terry and loved Chicago, and they became a regular band, the Whiskey, kind of like a house band. And one night they were playing a show and Jimi Hendrix was there, and they're like, hey, look in the back, Jimmy and his friends are there. So he said after the show, the door opens up backstage and Jimi Hendrix comes back and he goes, man, you are the baddest MFers in the world right now. Your music is amazing. And he said, I want to record you. And they said, we just signed a deal. We're going to be going to New York. And he said, you gotta let me produce it. You gotta let me produce it. But they couldn't. But imagine that. Imagine how cool that would have been. So this was the house that they were living at for that time when they started the band. He was there for 11 years before he passed away. Wrote, like I said, the whole first album in here. The first album, other than Introduction, he wanted that to just show how amazing the band was. Because originally, you know, even though we got to know them as kind of like a pop band, or like they were always in top 40, they were originally kind of like a avant-garde, kind of like a Mothers of Invention type band. So they eventually became that top 40 band. But the mark that Terry Kath would leave, he would be a part of 9 albums. So when they went to New York to record the album, the producer wanted to make it a double album, but it wasn't long enough. So he said, Terry, do that guitar song, do that guitar thing that you do. They just turned the lights down low and he recorded Freeform on guitar, and they said it was in one take. That was the only one he did, and it's just a really magical song. Pretty cool to see that. They actually won a Grammy the following year for Best New Artist from that album. Recorded the album in 14 days. We saw where it was written. They're taking the 101 out to Woodland Hills, the death site of Terry Kath. First album under the CTA name, Chicago Transit Authority, but then they got lawsuit threats, so they just dropped it and went with Chicago. So it's actually the house right behind this gated wall. I'll show you from a Zillow ad what it looks like. But it was in this house on January 23rd, 1978. Terry Kath was here. This was his roadie Don Johnson's house at the time. And he was staying here because he was preparing to start a solo record. See, the band was huge at this point. Chicago was, like I said, pretty much every album was in the top 40. And when they would do shows, Terry loved to just play whatever they wanted, but some of the band members were saying, you know, I think we should be playing the hits. And he just kind of felt like at this point he had done everything he could do with that band and was pretty much thinking of being done and starting something different, something without horns. He did not want horns. And unfortunately, he loved guns. He loved to target shoot and things like that. And so it was on the early afternoon of January 23rd, that evening he was supposed to start his solo record. It was here that he had one of his handguns out, and he was kind of messing around with it, and his friend said, hey, why don't you put that thing away? So Terry opened it up and took all the ammunition out, the clip and everything, and apparently one was left in the chamber that he didn't realize. Pointed it up to his head, kind of mocking Taxi Driver, his favorite movie, and pulled the trigger and accidentally took his own life. He was 31 years old, just about to be 32, had a daughter who was almost ready to turn 2, and he was gone. So sad. His wife used to say that, you know, he loved to target shoot and everything, and people would say he was pretty careless with a gun. I remember in the documentary that his daughter made, she goes out to Caribou Ranch, and when they're inside the house where he wrote some of the songs and where they lived, his wife looks down at the floor and says, oh, see that? That's a patch up of one of the bullet holes when he accidentally had a gun go off through the floor. And then they had a concert out there one time at the Caribou Ranch and invited a bunch of college kids. And to start the show, Terry came out and pulled his pistol out and shot it into the air. So sad. He was one of those people that loved fast cars, fast motorcycles, nature, and just when he was out in nature, he loved to, you know, shoot at trees and shoot at cans and things like that. And those days, 6 weeks before this, the band had kind of a band meeting where their manager slash producer said, hey, you guys gotta like shape it up. You guys are really out of control right now. And they kind of looked at Terry when they said it, and Terry got offended and he said, hey, the only one I'm listening to is Gurr, who was their producer. He said, the rest of you do more than I do. So some people believe that that meeting 6 weeks before this is possibly what led him to decide to kind of do his own project and everything, but he didn't even get a chance to start the first day of recording because he ended up accidentally shooting himself here. And there was a rumor, people believe that maybe he was sad and that he did it intentionally, but nobody that knew him believed that. The band Chicago did disband after this, but then they eventually did get back together. Back up here at Terry's final resting place. Just sad to think of what he could have potentially done, you know, the future music he could have made. I've read a lot of places where people said, you know, if you consider the fact that Chicago had so many members, including a whole horn section and everything, Terry never really got what a lot of people felt was his due as a phenomenal guitarist. They said if you put him in a three-piece band with bass and drums, you would have been talking about one of the biggest projects of all time. And people would often say, you know, it's just too bad that Terry and Jimi Hendrix never got to record anything or work together in the way that Jimmy would have liked, because it could have really been amazing. But Terry's daughter, many years later, put out this phenomenal documentary that you can actually find on YouTube. And she is basically looking to find out who he is since she lost him at such a young age. She wanted to know from the band members, from the friends, you know, what the story was, and to find his guitars, his lost instruments. It's a really fascinating documentary. And even though it was horribly sad, you know, that they lost him at that time, and that, you know, potentially he was going to leave Chicago and go solo or start this new band that his wife said, Cook County. But the other members of Chicago said it was, in a weird way, like a divine intervention in their life, because they said the whole band, it was the 70s, the whole band were drinking and doing drugs and pretty much spiraling out of control even when they confronted Terry. As he said, you guys are all doing more than me, 6 weeks before he passed. They said that it was his passing that woke them up, and they finally went on the straight and narrow and said that they were able to get their lives together and continue the band on. They said even when they did continue on, it took 2 guitar players to play Terry's parts. I mean, that says a lot about him as a musician, but they said they always felt an obligation, a responsibility to keep the band together so that people would never forget how great and how amazing of an artist he really was that we lost. And if I understood it correctly from the documentary, looks like many years later after Terry's passing, Kiefer Sutherland married Terry's widow and was the stepfather to his daughter Michelle. Kind of an interesting tie-in. I hate to, you know, the documentary's been out for a while, and I don't want to give any spoilers, but I will say that in his daughter's quest to find his guitars, she does end up going to Ray's house. Ray had already passed, she said, a couple months before, and she goes out there looking for the guitars. And I won't spoil and tell you what she finds, but definitely worth seeing. The Terry Kath experience. And on that note, Terry, rest in peace. One of the greatest guitar players of all time. 25 or 624. Many people say the greatest guitar solo of all time. Composer, guitarist, singer, and all-around wild man. Have a great night, everyone. Goodbye.